A farmer found the sheriff's orphan in the wheat field and took her home to stay. The wheat field should have been quiet at dawn, nothing but the rustle of grain and the low breath of the earth waking under the first light. But as Farmer Eli Turner walked the eastern rows with his sleeves rolled and his boots still wet with morning dew, he stopped cold because he heard a sound that did not belong to the field at all. A thin, frightened whimper carried through the tall stalks like a plea the land itself couldn't swallow. And when he pushed aside the gold-tipped wheat, he saw her, a small girl curled into herself, her dress dirt-stained, her hair tangled from wind and fear, her knees pulled tight to her chest, as if she was trying to make herself disappear. And Eli froze in place because, for a heartbeat, he thought she might be a ghost left behind by the night. But then she lifted her head, and those wide, terrified eyes locked onto him with the kind of desperation that told him she had not been hiding from the morning, but from the world. He knelt slowly so she wouldn't run, his big frame blocking the rising sun, and asked the softest question a man like him could manage. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" But she flinched as if even the gentlest voice might break her, shaking her head so quickly he wondered how long she had been trembling like that. And she whispered, barely more than breath, "Please don't take me back. Please, I can't go back." And though Eli didn't yet know who she was or what had driven her into his field before sunrise, he knew enough to understand that whoever she feared had earned that fear. So he kept his voice steady, saying, "You're safe right now. Nobody's taking you anywhere." And her small hands loosened just a little from the fists they had been gripping against her chest. He asked her name, and she swallowed hard before answering. "I'm Clara Hayes." And the moment she said Hayes, Eli's breath caught because Hayes wasn't just any name in these parts. Hayes was the sheriff who had died last winter under a sky full of snow, the sheriff who had left behind a daughter no one had seen since the funeral. And suddenly the truth fell together, like heavy grain hitting wood. This was the orphan everyone in town had spoken about with pity and whispers. The girl passed around from house to house because no one wanted to take responsibility for a child carrying that much grief, and something old and familiar tightened in Eli's chest. Something he hadn't felt since the day he lost his own wife and unborn child to the fever years ago. He rose slowly and held out his hand without touching her, letting the wind carry the steadiness in his voice, telling her she wasn't alone anymore, telling her she didn't have to stay in the wheat or run from shadows. And when Clara finally placed her small, trembling hand into his calloused one, Eli Turner understood that the morning had not brought a lost child into his field by accident. The land had given her to him, and he knew without speaking it aloud that he would not let her be taken from him again, no matter who came looking. Eli Turner carried Clara across the last stretch of the wheat, as gently as if she were made of breath instead of bone. Her small fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, her face tucked against his shoulder, as though she expected the world to snatch her back the moment she let go. And as he stepped through the gate toward the farmhouse, the morning light spilled over the porch boards and the quiet house that had stood too empty for too many years. A home that once echoed with laughter and warm footsteps before fever hollowed it out and left Eli to walk through it alone. And though he did not speak of it, the ache of that memory softened him in a way Clara could not see but felt, because she tightened her hold as if she sensed the house was more than wood and nails. It was a place where someone had grieved long enough. Inside, the kitchen looked just as it had the night before, a single plate waiting on the table, One chair pulled out as if Eli still sometimes sat across from someone who was no longer there. And Clara's eyes drifted to that chair as he set her down on her feet, her toes barely touching the cool wooden floorboards before she whispered, "Do you live here all alone?" And the question filled the room with a kind of gentle sorrow Eli had gotten used to carrying, but hearing it in her voice made it feel fresh again, so he cleared his throat, nodding once as he poured water into a tin cup and passed it to her, careful not to crowd her, saying quietly, "I do, but I reckon that's changing as of this morning." And the way she blinked at him made him realize how foreign the idea of being wanted must have felt to her. She drank slowly, each sip steadying her breath, and then, with the kind of small courage only a scared child can show, she asked, "Are you going to send me somewhere?" And Eli felt that question cut deeper than any truth she had offered, because it told him exactly how she had been living, from doorstep to doorstep, from one reluctant household to another, passed around like a burden instead of a blessing. And he shook his head firmly, lowering himself onto one knee so she would hear every word plain and sure, telling her, "You're not going anywhere you don't want to go, not today, not tomorrow. If you stay because you chose to." And Clara's eyes shimmered in a way that made him look away before the weight of that trust broke him wide open. She turned slowly, studying the house with its quiet hallway and sunlight stretching across the floor, as if memorizing every corner to decide whether she could fit inside a life that wasn't hers. And when her gaze returned to the single chair pulled out at the table, she walked over, touching its back with soft fingers, then moved it slightly, pulling a second chair beside it as if she were testing the idea of belonging. And Eli felt something shift in the air, like the house itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. And though neither of them spoke the truth of it aloud, that simple movement, the girl placing one more chair at a table meant for two, said enough to make the empty rooms feel a little less haunted, and the morning a little more like a beginning neither of them had expected. Clara sat at the table with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her feet not quite touching the floor, watching Eli move around the kitchen with a quiet steadiness that made the room feel safer than anything she remembered. And the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like two people learning the shape of each other's existence without wanting to startle it. But still, every so often her eyes darted to the window as if expecting someone to appear at the end of the road, and Eli noticed it each time, the small tremor of fear she tried to hide. So while he cracked eggs into the skillet and set bread to warm, he finally spoke without turning around, his voice calm like he was talking to the morning. "Who were you running from, Clara?" And the question hung there like dust in sunlight, not sharp or demanding, just patient enough that she didn't feel trapped by it. She didn't answer right away, her fingers tightening as though the truth might burn her palms, but the longer she looked at Eli's broad back and the way he worked in silence, the more she believed he wouldn't throw her out for speaking it. So she whispered, "I wasn't running from anyone. I was running from everyone." And that confession made Eli set the skillet aside and face her, because no child should speak words like that with such old sadness behind them. She swallowed hard before continuing, her voice barely carrying across the table. "After my papa died, nobody wanted me. They all said someone else would take me, and then someone else said the same, and the homes kept changing, and every time I tried to be good, it didn't matter, because they didn't want a girl who cried at night or woke up screaming." And Eli felt a storm rise in his chest at the thought of her grief being treated like fault instead of pain. but he kept still so he wouldn't frighten her with the anger that wasn't meant for her. Clara's eyes lifted, searching his face for disbelief or disappointment, and when she found none, she continued with a trembling breath. Yesterday, the woman whose house I stayed in said I was too much trouble and told me I'd be taken somewhere else in the morning, so I left before the sun came up. I thought maybe if I walked far enough, nobody would find me to give me away again. And she tried to smile, like she wanted the words to sound brave instead of broken. But Eli saw right through it, and something in him steadied with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. A knowing that taking her in wasn't an accident, nor charity, nor temporary mercy. He sat down across from her, his knees brushing the table as he leaned forward and told her the truth she deserved to hear. Clara, listen to me. You're not in anybody's way here, and you're not trouble, not to me. And she blinked fast like she didn't trust her ears yet, so he said it again, slower, firmer. You can stay here as long as you want, even if that means forever. And those last words hit her so hard her breath caught, because forever wasn't a word she had ever been given before. She looked down quickly, hiding the way her chin trembled, and managed to whisper, "Why would you want me?" And Eli reached across the table, not touching her, but close enough for the distance between them to feel smaller, answering softly, "Because this house has been too quiet for too long, and because you deserve a place that doesn't give up on you." And the way Clara closed her eyes for a heartbeat told him she was letting those words settle somewhere deep, maybe in a place where hope hadn't lived for a long time, and for the first time since finding her in the wheat field, Eli saw not just fear in her face, but the fragile beginning of trust, like a fragile seed breaking the soil long before anyone believes it will grow. By mid-morning, Eli had hitched the wagon to take Clara into town for supplies, something he hadn't planned on doing so soon. But she needed boots, a coat, and clothes that didn't hang off her like shadows that didn't fit. And Clara sat beside him with her hands clasped so tightly on her lap that her knuckles were pale, her eyes fixed on the road stretching ahead, each turn of the wheel seeming to remind her she was moving closer to people who might recognize her and decide her fate for her. Eli kept the reins loose and his voice steady, telling her gently, "Nobody in town's got any right to decide where you belong." But she didn't answer, only pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, a coat far too big for her, but warm enough to calm the trembling she couldn't quite hide. As they approached the general store, a few early townsfolk glanced their way, and the moment Clara stepped down from the wagon, whispers began to move through the air like dust on a breeze, soft but unmistakable. "That's the Hayes girl, Sheriff's Orphan. Didn't know she was still around." And Clara shrank back, inching closer to Eli's side, as if she were afraid those whispers might reach out and drag her away. But Eli stepped forward with a quiet authority that made even the murmurs pause, his hand hovering protectively near her shoulder without touching, signaling to the town as clearly as words that she was under his care. Inside the store, Mrs. Abbott, a broad woman with silvering hair and eyes sharper than a hawk, stopped stacking flour sacks when she saw Clara, her face softening in a way Clara clearly didn't trust yet, and she said, "My word, child, we thought you'd been sent east." And Clara's breath hitched in fear, as if even the mention of being sent anywhere else would shatter the thin sense of safety she'd gathered since morning. But Eli answered calmly before the girl could retreat. "She's staying with me." And the firmness in his tone made Mrs. Abbott blink, her gaze flicking between them as she realized the meaning behind those 4 words. She nodded quietly and began laying out clothes in Clara's size, speaking gently but not pitying. A kindness that seemed to confuse Clara more than comfort her, as she touched each garment like she expected it to vanish if she blinked. It wasn't until Mrs. Abbott placed a small pair of boots on the counter that Clara's voice finally broke in a whisper. "I'm sorry. I don't have money to pay," and Eli turned to her slowly, his expression softening in a way that made Mrs. Abbott pause mid-motion, and he said, "Clara, you don't owe me a thing." But the girl only shook her head, whispering again, "Everyone gets tired of feeding me, tired of keeping me. They say I take too much." And the quiet pain in those words was sharper than any accusation could have been. Mrs. Abbott's eyes glistened at the child's honesty, and she stepped around the counter to kneel in front of her, saying with a firmness that surprised Eli, "Listen here, sweetheart. Nobody in this town gets to blame a child for needing care." And Clara's startled gaze lifted as if she wasn't sure she deserved such a simple truth. Eli cleared his throat to steady himself, paid for the supplies, and led Clara toward the door. But before they stepped outside, Mrs. Abbott called after them softly, "Eli Turner, you best know what you're taking on." And he paused only long enough to look her in the eye and answer, "I do," a statement that settled over the room like a promise. As they walked back into the sunlight, the town still watching with curious eyes, Clara stayed close to him, but no longer hid behind him. And though she didn't realize it yet, this was the moment the town learned her name again, not as a burden passed from home to home, but as the girl the quiet farmer had chosen to keep. They were halfway home when the sky began to dim earlier than it should have, a thick sheet of clouds rolling over the prairie as if night had decided to arrive ahead of schedule. And Clara pulled the new coat tighter around herself, her gaze darting to every shadow like she expected something to leap from it. Eli noticed, keeping the reins steady, but his voice low and warm as he said, "Storm's moving in quicker than I thought. We'll be inside before it breaks." Yet, even that reassurance couldn't quiet the way Clara's fingers clutched the seat, her fear rising as naturally as breath when the first rumble of thunder shivered through the air. By the time they reached the farm, the wind had begun tearing across the wheat fields in restless sweeps, bending stalks like frightened bodies. And Clara hesitated at the threshold of the cabin, as if afraid something waited inside, some memory she hadn't yet found words for. But Eli merely lit the lamp and said, "Nothing in here's gonna harm you," and the gentle certainty in his voice coaxed her over the doorway at last. Supper was quiet, the storm clawing at the roof, while Clara kept glancing toward the windows as though the dark might reach through the glass and take her. And when the lightning finally split the sky in a jagged crack that shook the table, she choked on her breath and covered her ears, whispering, "Please, don't make me sleep alone. I won't run. Just don't make me stay by myself," her panic raw enough that Eli froze mid-reach for a plate, realizing suddenly that this wasn't simple fear. This was memory. He knelt beside her chair, keeping his voice steady, asking gently, "Clara, when was the last time thunder scared you this bad?" But she only shook her head hard, tears trembling along her lashes, and whispered, "The night my papa didn't come home. The sheriff said he'd be back before morning, but the thunder kept getting louder and louder, and when the men knocked on the door, Mama screamed because she already knew." And the way she folded into herself at the end of that story made Eli feel the weight of it settle in his own chest. The storm worsened until the walls rattled, and the prairie groaned under the wind, and Clara finally stood from the table, her small frame trembling, and whispered, "Please don't leave me." A plea so soft, Eli almost wondered if she meant it for him or for the father she had lost. But either way, he couldn't ignore it. He set up a pallet near the hearth for her, laying an extra quilt over it and adding wood to the fire until the room glowed warm enough to drown out the storm's fury, then dragged his own chair beside her bedding, settling in with a quiet firmness that made the fear in her eyes ease just a little. "I'll sit right here," he told her, "all night if I have to." And Clara lay down slowly, watching him with the exhausted vigilance of a child who had learned too soon that safety could vanish without warning. She fought sleep for as long as she could, her eyes flicking to the windows with every rumble of thunder, but eventually her breaths grew longer, softer, settling into the uneasy cadence of someone who had never known sleep without fear. Eli didn't move, not when his back began to ache, not when the fire dwindled, not even when the storm reached its loudest roar, because he understood that tonight wasn't about rest or storms or even promises. It was the night the farmer stood watch over the sheriff's orphan, a night he'd remember long after the thunder faded. The first night he realized he wasn't protecting a stranger anymore. He was protecting someone he couldn't stand to lose. Morning rose over the village in a wash of soft gold, turning the grasslands into a shimmering sea and painting the lodge tops with warm light. And Mira found herself walking beside Blue Willow, toward the council circle where the elders met. She hadn't expected to be summoned when the young runner arrived at their lodge with the message that the grandmothers wished to speak with the woman saved at the river. Her stomach had tightened with the old fear of judgment. But Blue Willow laid a steady hand between her shoulders and said, "When elders call, it is not to wound. They see things long before the rest of us." The council circle sat beneath a stand of cottonwoods older than memory, their branches whispering in the morning breeze as though carrying the voices of ancestors. The elders were already seated, wrapped in robes painted with stories, hunts, storms, births, victories, seasons turning like the wheel of the world. And at the center stood Chief Tahu, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable but grounded, as if this moment carried weight far deeper than she could yet understand. When Mira approached, the eldest among them, Grandmother Sani, whose hair fell in two long braids streaked silver white, lifted her chin and studied her with eyes that saw through flesh and fear alike. "Sit, daughter of the plains," she said, and Mira obeyed, her heartbeat drumming against her ribs. Grandmother Sani spoke first, her voice steady as riverstone. "We have watched the way you walk through this place, quiet, wounded, but listening. A woman who still listens, even after pain. Is a woman the spirits can speak through." Mira felt heat rush to her face, unsure how to answer, but the elder continued. "We saw the moment your voice returned. That is no small thing. Fear steals voices. Safety gives them back. But destiny," she tapped the ground with her carved staff, "destiny chooses when words become truth." Another elder, Hawkfeather, leaned forward, the feathers in his hair catching the sun. "The chief did not find you by accident. The river led him there, and the river does not lie." Mira's breath caught. She glanced at Tahu, but he kept his gaze lowered out of respect for the council's authority. Blue Willow squeezed her hand gently, urging her to breathe. Grandmother Sani's focus sharpened. "You must understand something, child. In our ways, a union is blessed not by desire alone, but by signs, by survival, by courage, by two lives brought together at the very edge of death. We see such signs around you and our chief." Mira's head spun. I never meant," she stammered, but Grandmother Sani lifted a hand to quiet her. "No one speaks of vows or binding," she said softly, "only of paths that cross for reasons larger than fear. A man who carries death on his shoulders does not kneel beside a wounded stranger unless the spirits push his feet there." The other elders nodded, murmuring agreement, and Mira felt her throat tighten. Not with fear, but with something she had not expected, a strange, trembling warmth that felt like possibility. Hawkfeather added, "If you choose to stay, you will not be seen as an outsider. The village will call you Tashina Wiyuka, the woman whose voice returned in truth." Mira blinked hard, fighting tears she didn't want to shed in front of so many eyes. Grandmother Sani leaned closer, her voice low and certain. "The tribe does not call something holy unless it has survived darkness to stand in the light. You and the chief have done both." And as the breeze moved through the cottonwoods and the circle fell silent, Mira felt something shift inside her. Not a promise, not a fate she couldn't escape, but the first quiet understanding that maybe the elders weren't declaring what she must become, but what she already was becoming. The knock came just after noon, sharp enough to rattle the small cabin window and freeze Clara where she sat peeling potatoes at the table, her shoulders tensing like a hunted animal hearing a trap snap shut. Eli glanced at her once, a soft, steadying look, before wiping his hands on a cloth and stepping toward the door, his boots sounding heavier than usual on the wooden floor. The kind of heaviness that came when a man already knew trouble had arrived before he opened it. When he swung the door wide, he found Sheriff Dobbs standing on the porch, hat low, coat dusty, eyes carrying that cautious official weight that usually meant his visit wasn't social. And beside him stood Mrs. Hargreaves from the church committee, her hands folded tight over her purse, as if she expected sin to spill out of the cabin the moment she blinked. "Afternoon, Eli," the sheriff said, not unkindly, but not relaxed either, and Eli gave a slow nod, stepping aside just enough to show civility, but not enough to invite them in without cause. Clara stayed at the table, but her back stiffened, her hands pausing mid-peel, her breath held in the fragile balance between hope and dread. "We got some questions," Dobbs said, glancing past Eli toward the small figure by the stove. "About the girl." Eli's jaw tightened in a way that wasn't hostile, but carried a message the sheriff understood. This house, this child, were under his protection now. And Dobbs raised both hands slightly, as if to say he wasn't here to start a war. "Relax, Eli. Folks in town are just talking. They're worried is all. A child found alone in a wheat field don't happen often, and people want to know if she's got kin. If she's been reported missing, if someone's looking for her." Clara ducked her head, curls slipping forward like a shield, the potato forgotten as she gripped the table's edge, her knuckles pale. Eli felt the shift in the room, a tightness he'd come to recognize as Clara bracing for loss, and he stepped forward, blocking their view of her. "She ain't going anywhere," he said, calm but firm, his voice carrying the same tone he used when calming frightened cattle during storms. Mrs. Hargreaves cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Walker, no one is accusing you of anything improper, but the town must ensure, well, propriety. A single man taking in a young girl raises concerns." Eli's eyes narrowed, but before he could answer, Clara whispered from behind him, "I can work. I don't cause trouble. Please don't make him send me away." The sheriff looked at her then, not with suspicion, but with something like reluctant sympathy, and he shifted uncomfortably, scraping his boot against the porch. "No one's taken you today, sweetheart," he said quietly. "But we need to know more before we let things settle." Eli stepped fully into the doorway, blocking the cold draft and every inch of the child behind him. "You'll know what you need to know when I find out myself," he said. "Until then, she stays." Dobbs studied him for a long moment, weighing the words, the man, and the fragile heartbeat of the home behind him, then finally tipped his hat. "We'll be back in a few days. Just be ready." When they walked away and Eli shut the door, Clara's breath finally broke out in a small, shaking sob, and he turned instantly. Kneeling beside her chair, his voice low but certain as he wiped the tear she tried to hide. "I told you," he murmured, "you're not losing this home, not while I'm still breathing." 2 days later, the truth arrived not on horseback or with a sheriff's badge, but in the form of a thin, dust-covered stranger who stepped onto Eli's land, just as the sun was sinking behind the wheat, his silhouette long and trembling like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his own bones. Eli spotted him first while repairing a fence rail, and Clara, who had been gathering fallen wheat heads nearby, froze the moment she saw the stranger's hat tip back, his eyes widening as if he'd found a ghost in the golden field. "Clara?" the man whispered, voice cracking open like something old and painful, and the girl's small body recoiled instinctively, her hand clutching Eli's sleeve before she could stop herself, her breath turning thin and panicked in her chest. Eli stepped in front of her without thinking, muscles tight beneath his shirt, his shadow cutting cleanly between the girl and the man. "State your business," he said, not rude, but not leaving room for softness either, because Clara was shaking now, and any man who caused that wasn't starting on level ground. The stranger swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a man fighting tears, and he removed his hat with a trembling hand. "My name's Anson Reed," he said quietly. I'm her father." The world seemed to tilt, the wheat sighing under a wind that hadn't existed a second before, and Clara took a step back as if the very word father were made of fire. She shook her head fast, her curls whipping her cheeks, and her small voice broke as she said, No, he left me. He left me there." Anson flinched, a genuine wound tearing through his expression. "Clara, sweetheart, please, I didn't leave you. You ran off when the wagon wheel snapped. I searched all night. The sheriff in Branton told me someone saw a girl heading east. I've been riding for days." Eli didn't move, didn't blink, didn't allow even an inch of space between Clara and the stranger. "She says you left her," he said simply, and the man's face crumpled, his breath shuddering out like a man punched in the ribs. "I lost your mother a month ago," Anson whispered, eyes glistening. "I wasn't thinking straight. I shouldn't have let her out of my sight. But I swear on her grave, I never meant to abandon my girl." Clara covered her ears, shaking harder now, overwhelmed by too many truths, too many ghosts, and Eli dropped to one knee beside her, grounding her with his hands on her shoulders, steady as bedrock. "You don't have to talk to him," he murmured, letting his voice be the soil her fear could take root in. "Not today, not until you want to." Anson stepped forward, just one step, but Eli rose in an instant, his height forcing the man to halt. "Give her space," Eli said, quiet but immovable. "She's safe here." The father's lips trembled. I just want her to know I didn't stop looking." "And she heard you," Eli replied. "But hearing ain't healing." Clara tugged Eli's sleeve again, burying her face against his arm, and Eli's voice gentled even further. "You can stay in the bunkhouse tonight, Mr. Reed. We'll talk when she's steady." As the dying sun bled into the horizon and the stranger walked slowly toward the empty bunkhouse, Clara clung tighter to Eli, her small voice barely a breath against him. "Please, don't make me go." And Eli, without hesitation, without doubt, answered with the honesty of a man who'd already chosen her long before she knew she needed choosing. "You're not going anywhere you don't want to," he said. "Not ever." Clara barely slept that night, and neither did Eli. She curled on the small cot near the kitchen stove, refusing the bedroom because she said it felt too far from him, and Eli sat at the table with a lantern burning low, fixing a broken hinge that didn't need fixing, just so the quiet didn't swallow them both. Glancing over every time she shifted, every time her breath trembled. Near dawn, she rose silently and walked to the porch, drawn to the pale light gathering over the wheat, and Eli followed her out, stepping barefoot onto the cool boards as she wrapped her thin arms around herself. "Is he still here?" she whispered, and Eli nodded once. "He's in the bunkhouse, hasn't made a sound." Clara's jaw trembled, but she didn't cry. She just stared at the horizon like she was trying to decide which life belonged to her. The one she came from, or the one she'd found by accident in a farmer's wheat field. Eli waited, letting her breathe, letting her choose the moment, and after a long stretch of silence, she finally spoke. "If he didn't leave me on purpose, then why didn't he find me sooner?" she asked, voice cracking like thin ice. Eli exhaled slowly, sitting beside her on the top step. "Sometimes grown men break in ways children never should," he said. "Losing your mother might have blinded him. Pain makes people slow, not uncaring." Clara stared at her hands, small and folded tight. "But if he loves me, why do I feel safer with you?" Eli's throat tightened, not from pride, but from the weight of her trust. A trust he'd never asked for, but now carried like something sacred. "Because I was the one who found you," he said softly. "And I'll keep you safe as long as you want me to." "But him showing up doesn't erase what you and I have." She leaned her head against his arm, the sun warming the horizon just enough to paint her hair with gold. "I don't want to go back with him," she whispered. "Even if he didn't mean to leave me, I don't feel like his anymore." Eli didn't speak at first. He let the words breathe, let the truth settle the way wheat settles after wind. "Clara," he finally murmured, "family isn't who you're born to. It's who keeps watch over you, who listens when you shake, who stays." She swallowed hard. "Do I get to choose?" He turned to her fully then, lowering his voice until it was barely a breath. "You do, and whatever you choose, I'll stand with you when you say it." A soft knock broke the morning stillness. Anson Reed, hat in his hands, eyes red and hollow. He didn't come on to the porch. He stayed at the bottom of the steps, as if understanding the boundary Eli had drawn in the dirt yesterday. "Clara," he said quietly, "I'm not here to take you. I just want you to hear me once. Then you can decide your own path." Clara stiffened, but Eli rested a calming hand on her back, steady and warm. She rose slowly, stepped down one step, but no further. "Go ahead," she whispered. Anson swallowed. "I didn't find you because I was drowning in my own grief. But that's not your burden. You deserve someone who saw you even in the dark, and that wasn't me. I won't ask you to come back. I'll only ask forgiveness someday, if you ever have enough to give." Clara's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Instead, she reached back, her small fingers curling around Eli's sleeve, anchoring herself. "I'm staying here," she said. "With him." Anson nodded, a broken acceptance softening his shoulders. "Then he's a better man than I ever managed to be." And as he walked away toward the long road home, Clara turned fully into Eli's side, whispering into his shirt, "You said I could choose. I choose you." Eli closed his eyes, letting the truth settle into him like sunrise over wheat. "Then I'll spend my life earning that," he breathed. The day Anson rode away, the farm didn't feel lighter or heavier. It simply felt clearer, as if the air itself had decided to stop holding its breath. And Clara sensed it too as she walked through the wheat beside Eli, her hand brushing the golden heads like she was introducing herself properly for the first time. She kept close to him, not clinging from fear anymore, but walking in step with the quiet certainty that she belonged here, and Eli matched her pace without speaking, letting her lead, letting her claim the land with her silence. Back at the farmhouse, she paused at the doorway, fingertips grazing the frame she once hid behind, and turned to him with a look that startled him with how steady it was. "Is it really all right that I stay?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Eli rested one hand on the doorframe above her, leaning slightly so she had to meet his eyes, not out of dominance, but out of reverence. "Clara, this place was safer the moment you stepped into it," he said softly, "and it'll be yours as long as you want." She nodded, and for the first time since he'd found her in the wheat, she stepped inside without hesitating, moving through each room deliberately, as if laying to rest the ghost of the frightened girl she'd been. Eli followed quietly, watching her take ownership, not of the space, but of herself. When she reached the kitchen, she stopped short, staring at the little shelf where Eli had placed her hair ribbon the night he first brought her in. It sat there folded neatly, untouched, but waiting. She lifted it gently, thumb running across the faded blue fabric. "You kept it," she whispered. "Didn't know if you'd want it back," he said. "But I didn't have the heart to throw it out." Clara tied it into her hair, and somehow that small act felt like planting roots. Later, when the sun dipped low, Eli lit the lanterns while she helped with supper, moving around the kitchen with a grace she didn't know she had. She laughed once, soft, startled, like she wasn't used to hearing herself, and Eli almost dropped the ladle, the sound hitting him somewhere deep. After dinner, she stepped onto the porch, gazing over the quiet fields. "Eli," she said without turning, "what happens now?" He joined her, leaning on the railing beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Now," he said, "you grow, however you want, however slow you need, and I'll be here, right here, until the day you tell me you don't want me to be." Clara looked up at him then, her eyes reflecting the last streaks of gold in the sky. "That day won't come," she murmured. A breeze moved through the wheat, and Eli finally let himself speak the truth he'd been holding. "Clara, I may not be your father, and I'm not trying to be. I'm just a man who found someone he wants to protect for the rest of his life." She stepped closer, not as a child seeking shelter, but as someone accepting a bond. "Then protect me," she whispered, "and let me stay." Eli reached out slowly, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear, gentle, asking permission, even in the touch. "You already do," he said. Behind them, the farmhouse glowed warm, steady, like it had been waiting years for both of them to arrive. And as Clara leaned her head against Eli's arm, watching the moon rise over the wheat, she felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not uncertainty, but a quiet, unshakable truth. She was home, forever, if she chose. And for the first time in her life, the choice was hers.